Without further ado, I think it's clear to assume that this audience is one uh, which is comprised of very, very determined Remainers and now probably Rejoiners. So the question remains, how might that happen? And I'm looking forward very much to hear what Anthony has to share with us on that subject. So over to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin, and good evening to everybody. Yes, indeed, I have some suggestions to make about something which is practical. It may not sound to you very likely, but it is a possibility, and it is something that we should work very hard to try to achieve, and I'll set that out. First, let me say, however, that if we who wanted to remain in the EU and who want to rejoin the EU as quickly as possible, if we were to do nothing at all, if nobody were to do anything at all, I'm morally certain that the United Kingdom or the different nations of the United Kingdom, if they've become separated in the interval, will be back in the EU and member states of the EU by the mid-century. The geopolitical realities, the economic realities, the fact that political fashions change, that parties come and go, that new people rise up, that pressures from the past come to bear, makes me feel pretty certain that even if we did nothing at all, England, Scotland, Wales, the whole of Ireland would be in the EU by the mid-century. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, what would happen to us in the interval outside the EU? How far would we diverge from the EU? How much would the EU itself have changed over the course of the next 30 years? And what would that mean for the nature of our rejoining the EU at that later stage? It seems to me that it's vastly better that we work extremely hard to try to get back into the EU as soon as we possibly can. And as I said at the outset, there is a way of doing this. In fact, however unlikely you think this might be, there is a possible route back into the EU within half a dozen years. And that is what I want to explain to you. It's realistic, although it's tough. As follows. First, I need you to bear in mind a couple of things. And this is not fighting old battles. This is because the war is still going on and we have to learn from these battles. The first thing that you have to bear in mind that in the autumn of 2019, we came this close to stopping Brexit. We came so close to stopping it. And if the opposition parties had not agreed to a general election, Brexit would not have happened. We would have got a second referendum, and already by that stage, the sentiment would have shifted and we would still be in the EU today, and all the mess which has resulted from Brexit in these last 9 or 10 months, we see the realities swarming in now that the transition period is over. None of that would have happened. So we came this close, and a very bad mistake was made by the opposition parties for different reasons. The Liberal Democrats thought that they were on a roll. They thought they had a big chance. The Labour Party, well, under Jeremy Corbyn, the Corbyn leadership group thought that this was their chance and probably their only chance. And so they went for broke, and it looks like broke is what has resulted. The other thing to remember is this. There has never been in any actual casting of votes. So forget about opinion polls. We can look at the opinion polls today. We can see that half the people polled say that leaving Europe was a mistake, and only just over a third of them think for some reason that it was a good idea, that it's going well. You see that in a poll published just today in the Times. We see that something in the region of 55 to 60% of voters don't want a Conservative government, and people somewhere in the region of 40 or just a bit over 40% do want a Conservative government, and yet we've got a Conservative government with a massive majority, and this is because of divisions and fragmentation of the centre left. So we have a problem of political culture in this country which needs to be addressed, and we will address it. I will address the question of that in a moment. So that's another thing to remember. There is not a majority in this country in favour of Brexit. On the contrary, there never has been. There has never been a case of actual votes cast in which more than 37% of the total electorate has voted for Brexit. That was the number in the 2016 referendum, 37% of the total electorate. And remember that that electorate was a restricted one. It was a general election franchise. It wasn't a referendum franchise. It excluded our own expats who'd been abroad for more than 15 years, who had a very, very material interest in the outcome. It excluded people, citizens of other EU countries, living here, paying taxes here, married to people here, bringing up children here. It didn't give them a voice, and they had a very material interest in the outcome. And it didn't follow the very good example of the 2014 independence referendum in Scotland of giving a voice to 16 and 17-year-olds whose immediate future was impacted by the decision. Had all those people been included in the franchise for the referendum, the Remain vote would have won easily. Their inclusion was discussed in the year before the referendum, and it was excluded. You may remember David Cameron, if you remember David Cameron, saying that he didn't want to have a fight with the right wing of his party over these matters, so he just went along with their demand that there shouldn't be an age extension, expats should be left out of account, and EU citizens should be left out of account. And yet, it was just a total of 37% of the total electorate who voted to leave. Now, you need to remember that it takes 40% of the total membership of a trades union for a strike to be legal. It takes 66% of all sitting MPs in the House of Commons to agree to a dissolution and a general election outside the terms of the Parliament. And the reason for a threshold like 40% or a supermajority like 66% is that the outcome could be very consequential. In the case of a general election, it could be a change of government. In the case of a strike, it could have a big impact on the people working in that industry and so on. And therefore, thresholds and supermajorities are a requirement. In June of 2015, the House of Commons published a briefing paper. The House of Commons very, very helpfully publishes in words of one syllable and just a few pages an explanation to MPs of what it is they're going to be voting on so that they have some idea. And in briefing paper 07212, published in early June of 2015, and you can look it up on the internet, in section 5, it warns the parliamentarians that this referendum can only be advisory. And in section 6, it says, if you were to make this in any way mandating, as some months later David Cameron did, he made it politically mandating, although constitutionally it was not mandating, then you have to build in a threshold or a supermajority requirement. None of those things was done. Mr. David Lidington, then the Minister for Europe in the House of Commons in the debate in mid-June 2015, said, we don't need to have a threshold or a supermajority because this is advisory only. As the briefing paper pointed out, it doesn't bind the government, it doesn't bind Parliament. And yet, David Cameron committed himself to it as mandating, and it has never been the case at any point that our House of Commons or our House of Lords has debated the following question. Should we take the advice of 37% of the total electorate and leave Europe? They never debated that question, because had they done so, the answer would have hit them right there in the question itself. So let us not forget that there has never been a case when a vote, either an actual vote cast, has ever been more than 37% of the electorate in favor of leave. In the general election of 2019, the Johnson Conservative Party got a massive 80-seat majority on 43% of votes cast, representing 29% of the electorate. Now, this fact is one which really has to make us sit up and take notice about how insufficient and dysfunctional our electoral system is in this country. And this indeed is the key to the whole matter of rejoining the EU. Our electoral system. So having mentioned everything that I've said so far for you to remember, the fact that there has never been a proper majority, there's never been a majority, let alone a proper majority, for Brexit in this country, and that therefore the use of 51.89% of votes cast on the 23rd of June as an excuse for treating an advisory referendum as if 100% of the population had asked to leave Europe. Just remembering those facts and remembering how unrepresentative the House of Commons is with its massive majority now. I mean, it's a really important point, this, because remember, Theresa May's election of 2017 resulted in a hung parliament. Wonderful. We had 2 years in which a parliament did what a parliament should be for, in which a legislature held the executive to account on every measure that the executive wished to see through the House. That is what a legislature should be. There shouldn't be an automatic majority that can be whipped through the lobby so that the executive can do whatever it likes. At the moment, with a huge 80-seat majority, the Johnson government can do whatever it likes, because its MPs don't even have to read the bills. They just have to obey the injunction to go through the lobby and vote in favor of the government. Otherwise, they don't get the party's help at the next election. They don't get the chance of ministerial position or preferment. Their careers are on the line. This whipping system is in itself extremely undemocratic, because it means that MPs don't represent their constituents or their country. They represent the party line and toe it. And so with a massive 80-seat majority on a minority of the actual votes cast and on a tiny minority of the overall electorate, we have a zombie parliament, a parliament in which the government of the day can do whatever it likes, and however many fine speeches are made on the floor of the House of Commons, and some of them are, it has no practical effect. But between the May and the Johnson elections, we saw Parliament doing a very good job. We saw people like Dominic Grieve and Anna Soubry and others really challenging the government and asking them hard questions, Ken Clarke and others. And that is what a parliament should be, which is why we need to reform the way that our parliament is elected and constituted, the House of Commons. So in December of 2019, massive majority, minority of a vote, and we now have a government in place which, well, I mean, words fail when you think about how, generally speaking, incompetent it has been, how corrupt it has been, how it has mismanaged the COVID crisis, how the deal that was hastily struck with the EU in order to claim that Brexit was done, oven ready, to win that election, and now it is all unraveling, and all the fine speeches about what a magnificent deal it was, and now it's all being blamed on the EU and on Remainers and etc. So we've seen how very, very quickly it's all unraveled. So what must we do, and how can we get back in? Now I want to address this question. Here is the timeline, and let me just set it out, and then I'll speak more particularly about each node in it. We need to get electoral reform. We need to get a reformed parliament in which the diversity of interests and preferences across the country, as expressed by Lib Dems and Greens and Labour Party and Conservatives and Plaid, Cymru and SNP, that all these voices have a proper representation proportional to their strength in the country. Almost certainly, therefore, there would be a coalition government. Almost certainly that coalition government would be a centre-left government. It would be a Labour, Lib Dem, Green coalition. And a coalition government in a reformed parliament would be very receptive to a vociferous and very powerful campaign of the kind that we mounted between 2016 and 2020, with 1 million people marches, a very, very strong campaign for another say on Europe. A reformed House of Commons would be receptive to that, may even indeed itself seek to rejoin the EU, because the logic of the situation is we need to be in the single market and the customs union. And if we are going to be in them, why not have a say over how they're run rather than just be rule takers? That was an argument that people put forward in the past. That is quite right. And therefore rejoining is the logic. Now, if a coalition government didn't do it, they might very well be receptive to the people having another say on European membership, and we can be very confident that we would win. And in fact, talking about the referendum that we may very well be offered in the next few years, it's very important that we should conduct ourselves in that referendum much more vigorously than we did back in 2016. So the first step is to get electoral reform, because if we had a reformed parliament, it would be receptive to another say on Europe, and that say would get us back into Europe. So now, how do we get electoral reform? Well, the way we get electoral reform is for all the opposition groups, Labour, Lib Dem, Greens, Renew Party, applied to work together to ensure that at the next election, the Conservative Party, the current Conservative government is defeated and a coalition government is formed. So we have to get the opposition parties to work together on a platform for electoral reform. Now, at the moment, as you see, Labour Party is the big fly in the ointment here, because there was an extremely strong move within the Labour Party to get the party to commit itself to electoral reform. A large majority of members of the Labour Party wanted it. It was blocked by the trades unions at the last conference. But this is not a reason for giving up the fight. On the contrary, I'll be saying something in a minute or two about what we need to do on that front. But the key, absolutely the key point, is to get the opposition groups to agree together, to work together at the next election in order to get the Conservative government out. And part of that common ground has to be, I mean, in all logic, it has to be, because the agreement of Liberal Democrats and Greens and others to an electoral pact of some kind, whether formal or informal, will be that the Parliament would immediately address the question of electoral reform, obviously. So the ideal scenario is all the opposition parties agree, they form a pact, whether formal or informal. As a result, there is a hung Parliament in which the coalition, and I'm saying this, by the way, because there is no way that any of the opposition parties, including Labour, can hope to get an overall majority. If Labour thinks that it can without Scotland and within the current political climate, it is dreaming. It simply can't do it, which is why it is so important that the Labour Party wake up and realize they have to work together with the other opposition parties. Now, if some kind of pact, formal or otherwise, were made, and if electoral reform were a plank of it, and a coalition is formed after the next election, one of the very first things it would do is to reform the electoral system. Single transferable vote is the simplest, most effective, functional way of getting proportional representation. Have another election on that basis, and then have a reform parliament to which the question of another say on Europe can be put. And all this could happen. The next election is going to happen in less than 3 years' time. A reformed Parliament could be in place in something like 4 to 5 years' time. And immediately in the aftermath of a reformed Parliament being seated, the demand for another say on European membership could be at the very top of the agenda, 6 years. That is why I say 6 years. Now, before I say anything else, it's a really, really key point that the drive, the campaign, the clamour for electoral reform and for getting all the opposition parties to work together to get electoral reform must, in the short term, be decoupled from the question of rejoining the EU. If you make electoral reform a key stepping stone in all our discussions and debates for getting back into Europe, then we won't get as many people under the electoral reform umbrella as possible. Because I'm sure there will be people who can see that we need to reform our electoral system, and yet who have doubts, or even maybe don't want to see us back in the EU. And we don't want to exclude such people. We need a broad church for electoral reform. And then the step after that will be to start the drive for rejoining the EU. So the first key matter is getting electoral reform on the agenda. To get it, we need to get the opposition parties to work together. And it is we, people like us, people in this meeting, it is we who have to do something about this, because we cannot any longer put up with political parties, activists and leaderships telling us what they are prepared to offer us in the way of a manifesto. For far too long, we voters have supinely waited to hear what the manifesto is, and then we have to take it or leave it as a lump. We can't cherry pick it. Because of our voting system, it's all or nothing. And we wait for the Labour Party leadership and its conference and activists at the conference to decide what they're going to offer us. This has to stop. We citizens have now got to act in order to force all the opposition parties to take seriously this vital demand for electoral reform. One example of citizens' action, and I think there should be a much more general wave of citizens' action in our country. And I'm going to refer you to the website of Alliance for Europe. That's Alliance number 4 for Europe, number 4E, Alliance for Europe, which has a lot of advice about citizens groups. There's information about where funding can be secured for citizens' action and so on. And I really want to recommend this. But you guys on this Zoom meeting should be inviting your local MPs, the local candidates of other parties, activists and chairmen of local parties, or whoever, and you should be inviting them to these meetings, not to ask them what their policies are that they're prepared to offer you, but for you to grill the heck out of them on why they are not working with all the other parties on electoral reform. Now, this, of course, mainly addresses the Labour Party question, because in fact, all the other parties do want electoral reform, and they are prepared to work together in constituencies to stand aside for whichever party has a better chance of winning in that seat. It is the Labour Party which is the standout party. Now, I am very deeply critical at the moment, having been often actually a member of the Labour Party. So you can infer from that the number of times that in vast irritation, I've torn up my card and written cross letters to the leadership, but I mean, neither here nor there. The fact is that the Labour Party is the obstacle at the moment. Labour has got to wake up. It's got to work with the other parties. It has got to accept the tremendous importance of electoral reform, because our unreformed House of Commons and our first past the post electoral system just is the rotten floorboards which have given way in this last 5 or 6 years. It is this very dysfunctional character of our whole political process. If you have first past the post, you get two political groupings who have a chance of power. Labour, Conservative, Democrats, Republicans, they have first past the post in elections for the House of Representatives in the United States. They have first past the post in Canada. They have first past the post in India. They've got a system in Australia which is sort of quasi-reform, but it still results, it's a very poor version of a PR system, because it results in two political groupings. And if you have two political groupings, they vie with one another to get their hands on the levers of power. One of them wins. And for the rest of that parliament, you have a one-party state, because they've got a majority inflated by the first past the post system and unrepresentative of the country, and they do what they jolly well like. And this, the result of this has been the collapse of our system. We are looking at our country falling apart at the moment, because this way of constituting a government and putting power into people's hands is so dysfunctional. It is very easy to illustrate why this is so. Imagine a constituency with 100 voters, 10 people stand for election, 8 people get 10 votes each, one person gets 9 votes, and the last person gets 11 votes. Who goes to Parliament on the first past the post system? The person with 11 votes. 89 people in the constituency are completely unrepresented. Their vote was worth nothing. In fact, the first past the post system is even worse than people realize, because not only if you vote for a losing candidate does your vote count for nothing, because you get no representation at all, but if you don't vote, you thereby support the person who wins. So if you live in a constituency where party A always wins, they've got a natural majority there, the party you support never wins, so you don't vote, your failure to vote actually enhances the margin by which the person who does win wins. Now, this is a very, very unrepresentative system. It's a very distorting system. It has always been known to be so. Back in the 1860s, now I know you were all reading John Stuart Mill in bed last night, his book, Representative Government. You may very well remember him saying in that book, well, we have a very odd arrangement here, but even though our parliament has unbridled power, we have an uncodified constitution, Nothing limits the power of Parliament to do anything it likes. Leslie Stephen, in an article published at about the same time as Mill's book, said, if Parliament legislated that all babies under the age of 3 should be murdered, killed, then that is the law and it has to be done. And John Stuart Mill said, yes, Parliament has complete sovereignty, complete discretion. It can do what it likes. Anybody who's got a majority in Parliament can do, in effect, what they like. But our MPs are gentlemen. So, of course, they won't abuse their powers. Well, having gentlemen as MPs is a ship that sailed quite a long time ago, I think, and we can see from how things are in Parliament now that we can no longer rely on self-restraint or conventions or gentlemanly behavior. A very, very, very long time ago, back in the 2nd or 3rd century BC in China, there was a philosopher called Han Fei who told a little anecdote. He told an anecdote about a farmer in a field, ploughing his field, and a hare came racing through the field, smashed into a tree, broke its neck and died. The farmer skinned it and cooked it and ate it, and it was delicious. So he threw away his plough and he sat by the tree and waited for another hare to come along. And Han Fei said, if you wait for another hare, that is, if you wait for a good politician, you're going to be disappointed. What you should do is not rely on personalities and people. You should rely on a system of laws. It's exactly the same thing that Livy said. You may remember, again, from your studies. Beginning of book 2 of From the Foundation of the City by Livy, he said, when we Romans had thrown out the haughty Tarquins, these proud, abusive kings, we instituted in their place the rule of law, the idea of a codified constitution which so arranges matters that in elections we get a proper representative spread of preferences and opinions across the country. Almost certainly, therefore, we get coalition government. And people who argue against coalitions, well, the fact is that coalition governments, when they're formed, tend to be more moderate than one-party government. Almost all our neighbours in Europe have proportional representation electoral systems and coalition governments. They are more stable and they have better functioning economies than we do here. Some of you will notice that there was an election in the Netherlands back in March, and they still haven't quite formed the government yet. There's still a lot of discussion going on about forming a new government. People think this is dreadful. I think it is the sign of maturity, the sign of the fact that all the political groups are working out what is going to be the best interest in the country overall, given that they all represent different interests and needs in the country. And this seems to me to be very, very mature-minded. They're not frightened or panicked by the fact that they're putting what will in effect be a government of national unity in place, a coalition government in place. They're quite happy with it. What we get here is one-party state between elections, and what Lord Hailsham back in the 1970s called elective dictatorship. This has got to stop. This has got to stop. To stop it, we've got to get the Labour Party to work with other parties and to commit itself to electoral reform. And once we've got electoral reform and once we've got a reform parliament, we will be, and again I say decouple this from the rejoin agenda because we want to get everybody under the electoral reform umbrella. But once we've got electoral reform, then we swing into action, we get our other say on Europe, and we will be back in Europe, and it will not have been too long for too much damage to be done, too great divergence to happen. And I'll end on this point now. When that time comes, when the time comes to campaign for our second referendum and for that referendum, we have to avoid the mistake we made back in 2016. Back in 2016, we just pointed out a range of facts about the impact that leaving the EU would have on us, on our economy, and on our prospects. And it has turned out to be even worse in even shorter a length of time than we thought. Right, so that's that. Project Fear has turned out to be Project Understatement, all right? But what we didn't do, and that was right, and now we've learned, and we've learned the hard way, just how true that perspective is. Those of us who remember the 1970s, you may remember piles of uncollected rubbish, unburied dead, 3-day week, power outages, strikes, Chancellor of the Exchequer going off to the IMF with a begging bowl. You may remember all that. And then you may remember how our membership of the EEC and the EU has benefited us, even indeed protected us from ourselves, really, and our own economic weaknesses and political weaknesses up until this point. But in addition to saying, we told you so, about the impact on the economy and so on, we have to make the case for Europe. Now, the European Union is a very flawed, and it needs reform because it is a work in progress. You can't expect, a building which is still being put up, still got the scaffolding around it, hasn't got the roof on it yet. You can't expect it to be a 5-star hotel, which is what for years and years the Express and the Mail and the Telegraph and so on have been complaining it isn't. It's a work in progress. We should be part of that work. We should be doing this thing, helping to build what is the most magnificent and imaginative project for peace, for unity, for progress, for cooperation. It is the most extraordinary, imaginative, and rather remarkable thing in human history, or at least since the Roman Empire was a kind of an EU. Although the Roman Empire wasn't quite as benign in all respects as the EU is. The EU is a remarkable example of an immense amount of soft power in the world, because nobody can trade with the EU unless they meet its standards. Standards on food production, standards on quality of goods, even indeed standards on human rights considerations relating to workers producing those goods. This is pretty remarkable. I mean, when you consider that the other great centers of power in our world, like the United States and China now, are in fact 19th century gunboat countries, they think that military power and economic power go hand in hand, and that's how you have influence in the world. But the EU is not a military power, not particularly, although there's now some talk about a EU defense force and so on, but it's not particularly interested in being a great military saber-rattling power. And yet, by means of those standards and regulations that it imposes, it's had a tremendously beneficent effect on the world outside the EU. But forget the world outside the EU, just think about the fact that this is a very, very remarkable project in a part of the world which for hundreds of years has seen the most dreadful internecine strife. I say to people, go on YouTube, look at 2 minutes footage of Europe in 1945 and ask yourself the question, is that a Europe that we would ever want to go back to? Look at European history, just know a little, just a smidgen of history, and think about the imagination and the beneficence of the EU project. And we should be part of it. We should be helping to build that. We should be right there. We're a big economy. We've had a leading voice in Europe. In fact, in all the time that we've been part of Europe, we have been, despite everything you've heard from Mrs. Thatcher and her handbag and the Daily Express and Daily Mail and so on, we've been pretty constructive partners. There are many aspects of European law, European regulations, European structure, like, for example, the single market itself, which our diplomats and our civil servants have been very constructive partners in building. And many of our EU neighbors, half of the EU is made up of rather small countries, by the way, countries which are no bigger in population or GDP than Scotland. But many of those small countries in the EU have always been very grateful to the UK's contribution to what happens in EU discussions in the Commission and in Parliament. We did play a constructive role there, and we jolly well ought to be playing that role in the EU again and soon. So we should talk up the extraordinary, benign, magnificent, imaginative project for peace and cooperation, which is the EU. You can point out to people back in the middle of the 19th century, Cobden and Bright, remember them, the free traders, they argued that if countries are intimately related to one another through trade, there will be peace between them. It's not possible to go to war with your most intimate trading partners. Tom Paine, of all people, back at the end of the 18th century, said exactly the same thing. Peace depends upon trade and cooperation. And this is what the founding fathers of the EU saw in the wreckage of Europe in the late 1940s, beginning of the 1950s. And that is what, look at the roots, look at the concept of the EU. That is the thing that we should be fighting for. So when that opportunity comes to put the argument for rejoining the EU sooner rather than later in a reform parliament, that is the kind of thing that we need to be arguing. But our first step is to get a reform parliament. The steps to that involve us, we citizens, taking the fight to the current political parties in the current first past the post system and getting them, and most especially the Labour Party, to wake up, grow up, work together, get the Conservative government out and introduce electoral reform. That is an absolute essential. So it's over to us as citizens. Invite all the different people involved in all the different political parties, anywhere within 100 miles of York, get them into a Zoom meeting and challenge them. Don't invite them to come and tell you what they're going to offer you. Invite them so that you, citizens, can say what we want to see happen. That, Martin, is the end of my rant.
Okay. Good. Okay. So Don, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the time. That flew that time. I found it very inspiring, very motivating, and also as a frequent member of the Labour Party, I shall use that phrase again. I found it exhilarating. Thank you. We are now, that was 40 minutes, although it didn't seem like it. Now we have two options, Anthony. Either we have half an hour of questions or we have 20 minutes of questions. It depends on your evening.
Well, I would love it to be 2 hours of questions, but we might have to keep it down to the 8:30 limit because I've got...
Oh, 8:30. Yes, okay, that's fine. We've got 20 minutes. Right, we'll get on. I'll just say before people disappear is there's some new faces for me on here tonight. I think we're well motivated to do stuff. If you live near York and you want to make contact with York for Europe, the easiest way is through our website. We're doing more and more things. I won't bore you now, but it's yorkeuropean.uk. If you Google something like that, you'll get it. If you get really stuck, email the address you got your link from. That's enough advertising. Now, reading instructions on how we're going to work. I'm afraid no one here is technically super brilliant, so we're doing it the simple way as it was described. So under reactions, button probably at the bottom of your screen, if you want to ask a question, keep it very short. We haven't got time, obviously, for statements and life histories, but a short, pithy question would be very welcome. Raise your yellow hand under reactions and wait to be called, then unmute yourself, ask your question concisely, then mute yourself immediately so we don't hear other people's dogs, and then lower your hand immediately after that so I don't call you again. So just to go over that very quickly again, find reactions, yellow hand, raise it, unmute yourself when I see you and call you, then ask your question concisely, mute yourself afterwards and lower your hand afterwards. Right, let me see if we've got any
raised hands.
Any hands? Where do we get this? Reactions.
Sean has got a hand up, and so is Jill.
Yes.
Right.
And Dorothy.
You can just
we're
on the
right.
screen, honey.
So that's right. I'm trying to unmute or asking Sean to unmute, sir.
Unmute. Yep.
Well done, Sean. Go ahead.
Right. I'm trying to think of a pithy question, but because Anthony is already. I'm here with two hats on. I'm here both for York for Europe, which I've been a long-term supporter of, but also as the coordinator of York Make Votes Matter. And therefore I'd like to, obviously Anthony's analysis ties in very closely with my own analysis of the priorities ahead. How do you think, Anthony, we can actually get the Labour Party on board in terms of obviously 80% of the constituency Labour parties voted for PR at the conference. It was the affiliates, the trade unions principally, that did not. A number of them do have policy conferences coming up. I believe Unite has a conference next week. Do you think there's any major prospect of a shift in the trade unions in order to actually provide an overall majority within Labour?
Well, there is a possibility of it. I know that there are a lot of people, campaigning and lobbying the unions. I think Make Votes Matter is doing that also at a kind of national level. And absolutely everybody should be harassing them, harassing the Labour Party, harassing the unions, harassing everybody, stop people in the street and buttonhole them in the pub, be like the Ancient Mariner, and getting everybody alerted to the fact that this is crucial. I mean, this is our salvation as a country, as a people. Absolutely depends upon reforming our electoral system so we can get responsible, clean government. And one big argument that one should be using in this respect is that our voting system is unfair. We pride ourselves as a people on caring about fairness and caring about justice. I don't know where that's gone recently in government terms, but certainly it is an argument that we should be running. So I very much hope that with the union meetings coming up and with a general vigorous campaign directed at them, directed at Labour, directed at everybody, as a result of us no longer sitting back and waiting to be told what we can be offered, but demanding it, that we can get a shift. We've got 2 years to do it in.
Thank you. Jill Barnes.
Hi, current Labour member who has remained a Labour member so that I can fight for this from within Labour Party. Obviously, it's difficult for Labour because they are the ones who are going to lose votes if they enter in, if we get to PR. But my question is not really about Labour. I mean, we can join Labour and we can campaign from within, or there are people within Labour who actually are pushing towards a split of the Labour Party, left and centre left. And maybe a split would be a good blessing, because then Labour would wake up and realise they can't win on their own if the left split off, the Corbyn fanatics. But my question is about the cooperation and whether there are electoral rules that will get in the way of the parties cooperating with each other, spending rules and etc. So it's a nice idea. I'm fully behind it, that we need to have the opposition parties working together at the next election. But how is that done? Are there practical obstacles to that with electoral rules?
There are practicalities that have to be addressed and dealt with. There are people who argue that there is, in fact, an outright constitutional barrier to a formal pact being formed between parties, but there are ways around it. One, for example, is that at the last election, a number of different bodies issued what turned out to be slightly conflicting advice about tactical voting in different constituencies. We've seen tactical voting working in by-elections extremely well, but in general elections, people tend to revert to type. So if by the time the next election was looming on the horizon, that is to say, just a couple of months away or 6 weeks away, and there was no agreement among the opposition parties about who will support whom, tacitly or otherwise, in constituencies, then there needs to be one organization. For example, Best for Britain, which did a pretty good job on the tactical voting front last time, one organization which has an authoritative advice to give people about how they might vote tactically in their own constituency. And there wouldn't be a problem with that. That is just a matter of a published opinion. And if people complied, if by then people were so fed up with having nothing to eat and no petrol in their cars and no doctors to see and, et cetera, then it might work.
Okay, thanks.
We've got, Peter Robinson's got his hand up. Good. Can you unmute yourself, Peter? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, how do we rebuild the trust of the European project to allow us to rejoin Europe?
Well, it's a good question. What is Europe's opinion of us? Well, Europe's opinion of Boris Johnson and this Conservative government is extremely low. And at long last, we've heard one European leader, Leo Varadkar in Ireland, saying, these are dishonest people, they can't be trusted. Now, who would enter any trade agreement with them because they renege on agreements and so on. But it is Johnson and the Tories and the Brexiter cabal, the ERG, it's that group of people who have been moaning, whining and campaigning for years and years and years to drag us out of the EU, who are disliked and mistrusted. People, our friends and neighbors in Europe, our kinfolk in Europe, they know that we have the largest and most active pro-European movement in Europe. They know that what the data is, what the polling figures are. They know that since 1970, between 1975 and 2015, UKIP was a little rump party. That there weren't groups like this all over the country, constantly campaigning and wanting to get back into the EU and having meetings like this even after we've left. So it's a very, very different scenario. And the European Union would very much like the United Kingdom to rejoin. They've said it. They've said the door is always open. They want us back in. It makes a very, very big difference to the economic balance of the EU that we should be. And I think also the sort of Donald Tusks and the other people who are so much more mature-minded than our own politicians, certainly, well, on all spectrums here, certainly realize that a rejoined UK would, as a result of this experience, probably be a pretty good partner in the EU. We would be chastened by the folly of what we've done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sue Cook, you've got a question.
Yeah, my understanding is when we were in the EU, there were very good reasons not to be in the euro and to retain sterling. I understand if we were to try and get back into Europe, we would have to be part of the euro. And I've got very mixed feelings about that. So I'd be interested to know how you would respond to that issue about the euro.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sue. It's not clear that would be a condition of rejoining, a sort of a line in the sand kind of condition of rejoining. There are a number of countries in the EU which are not part of the euro, and my view is that the EU would rather have the UK back in as a full member than to impose conditions on it that it's not ready to accept. Personally, however, I mean, quite independently of whether or not it would be a condition, I personally wouldn't mind us being in the euro or being part of Schengen. Those are things that wouldn't bother me personally, because I think that there are arguments pro as well as anti. And I also think that if you look at historical examples, look at the United States of America, when finally in the 19th century, the decision was taken to have a single currency in all the states of the Union there. Just what a big difference it made to that immense expansion in the American economy in the last third of the 19th century, application of the Turner thesis after the Civil War and the westward expansion. The arguments pro and con, the con arguments are ones that much more apply, back to the crashing out of the European monetary system back in the 90s, you may remember. That was a different set of conditions. The EU itself was only just then as the EU, transitioning from being the EEC into the EU, with the, all the Lisbon arrangements at that time. So conditions have changed. It may very well be that in 6 years' time or in 10 years' time, a rather reduced and weakened UK economy, or perhaps English economy if Scotland by that time is independent and back in the EU, might very well benefit from joining the euro. It will depend on circumstances. But the short answer to your question is, it's not cut and dried that it would be a condition of rejoining, and the EU would much rather see the UK back in the EU than to impose line in the sand type conditions on it, which would be unacceptable.
Okay, we've got about 6 minutes left, so I'll try and get about 3 questions in at maximum. I've got a hand that's been up behind me, wants to ask a question. So Barbara, you're next in line chronologically.
Okay. Well, actually, it's two questions. One is that I know you've been doing a series of talks, and I wondered what the moods you found around the country when you've been giving the talks. And the other one was, I was on a Zoom with Dominic Grieve, a European movement, and he was hinting darkly that there were moves within the Conservative Party who have great discontent for Johnson. I don't know if you know anything about it, but you probably move in higher circles than I do. I wonder if you could, if you were able to say anything.
Well, I find that the reaction that I get to the ideas that I put, such as I've put forward this evening, to all the groups that I've been speaking to, because as you correctly point out, I've been doing a kind of virtual tour of the country. It's been very positive. There's a lot of eagerness, a lot of desire to be back in the EU, a lot of hunger to find out what can be done and how one can get involved. I'm personally pleased that the European movement now has Andrew Adonis at its head, because he, rather like me, is very gung-ho about trying to make this happen sooner rather than later, and not, there are incrementalists among. I chair a group of interested parties, different organizations like European Movement, Best for Britain, the Grassroots for Europe, I mean, all the different organizations. And we meet on a regular basis, and I chair that meeting, and I hear, therefore, a number of different takes. And there are some people who think we have to be incrementalist about this. We should try to join EFTA, or we should try to rejoin the single market and the customs union without being full members, and then gradually move from there and so on. Whereas Andrew and I and various other people, Edward Macmillan Scott, who's a former MEP, are of the view that we should go, all out for it. I think that really wanting to be in the EU, talking about the benefits of being in the EU, saying the kinds of things that I was saying earlier about what a great project it is, despite all its flaws and despite the need for reform, is something that we should be banging the drum about. That's what I think. Then as to your second question, yes, there is an enormous amount of dissatisfaction and unhappiness. I mean, there are people in the Conservative Party and MPs in the Conservative Party who are appalled. I mean, it's not just discontent. They are as aghast and appalled as any other right-thinking person is about some of what has been done and said, and the way that the government is behaving. So they might very well say, watch this space. But you see, the big difference between the Conservative Party, the right in this country, and all the different centre-left groups in this country, is that they're prepared to keep their mouths shut, keep their internecine battles, sub rosa. And when it comes to election time, they jolly well work together and sing from the same hymn sheet. You only have to look at people like this wretched man Frost and Liz Truss and people like that, all mightily singing the praises of the EU and how dreadful Brexit would be, and now how wonderful Brexit is and how we've got to make it work and so on, to see just how people on the right can do this. I mean, it sort of comes naturally to them in a way that doesn't come naturally to people on the centre left, who care a little bit more, I think, about principle and political honesty and so on. Principle and honesty in politics, well, I'm afraid that's oxymoronic.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. We've got 4 questions, so we won't get through all those. We'll probably get through just one more, so no more questions. But Susan Humphreys, please unmute yourself.
Yep. I was interested that, I mean, it kind of follows on from what you were saying about choosing not to go the way of say something like the Norway deal of returning to the customs union and single market. But I'm wondering, what do you think the Labour Party might mean by make Brexit work? Nothing's been specified, but I wonder what they possibly can mean by that, and what you think they might, and whether you think there is anything in that direction.
Well, of course, one doesn't know that they're trying desperately not to commit themselves to anything, because, of course, unlike the Conservative Party, the Labour Party does not get a free pass from the press. They only have to, one slip of the tongue and they will be harassed and persecuted by the press to death. So they have to be extremely careful in what they say. They could mean we have to rejoin the single market. They could mean we need to renegotiate the current deal to make it a bit softer, to deal with tariffs. There's a whole range of things that they might mean. My own suspicion is that if there's anybody in the Labour Party, higher ranks of the Labour Party, if there's anybody there who is serious about the welfare of our economy and its people, thinking about a single person losing his or her job, a family being impacted, the community being, having shops closing and so on because too many people in the local area are unemployed. If there's anybody who's serious about that, at the very least, what they mean by a closer relationship would be membership of the single market and the customs union, at the very least. Their problem is that they are frightened of the red wall voters who voted for Brexit because of immigration, because the argument about immigration has not been won or had properly. The fact that immigrants to our country add to the country, they bring skills and expertise, they add to GDP, they don't take away. The fact that we've got a labour shortage now should be a clear message on this. But the Labour Party are afraid of what they think of as a traditional base, which is anti-immigrant. And that's a conversation which hasn't been properly had yet. Anyway, short answer, they could mean pretty well anything.
Anthony, we're up time. Would you take just one more question, please?
Go on, I'll take two more. How's that?
Oh, even better. Now, there's a lady called iPad who's going to unmute herself and tell us who she really is. She's lurking in the shadows.
Yeah, I'm Christine, and what I'd like to ask is the government at the moment is trying to form various trade deals with other countries. If they do manage to form a trade deal, how would that impact us in getting back into Europe? Because all our standards and everything would fall. How would that work?
Well, that's a very good point. My opening remarks were about trying to get back in the EU sooner rather than later, precisely because of the divergence issue. What we don't want to do is for our standards to fall so far below that it will take us, the EU will say, well, you've got to take 2 or 3 years now to start recalibrating and doing better. Already we've seen that our water standards, rivers and beaches and stuff have suffered terribly just in these first 9 or 10 months of being out of the EU. So it is a very good point that you're raising, an important point. That's a reason, by the way, why we should all of us be as vigorous as we possibly can be in making this happen soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Gregg, I will ask you to unmute, and then Martin Brooks will say farewell on behalf of all of us. So Mary Gregg, can we have your question, please?
In view of the fact that Martin's is the last question, we should take that one too. I'm so sorry, Mary. You fire away.
Could I just say this question is from Chris Chandy, who has no sight, so you won't you won't see him. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, Chris Chandy here. I would be very worried that Boris Johnson isn't going to start gerrymandering like hell for the next election, such that all these great plans that you suggested would just not have any chance. He's going to know that the other parties might get together, and he's going to do everything, boundary changes, all these tricks he will try, just like Trump did, to stop anybody else winning the election but the Tories. What do you think?
Oh yes, I think you're quite right, and he's doing it already. As you say, the boundary changes were in process anyway, and they advantaged the Conservative Party. This voter suppression business requiring IDs on the basis of the fact that there was one prosecution for fraudulent voting at the last election, that's another aspect of this. And I'm quite sure, there might, in fact, I think there was even talk of bringing in further legislation to prevent cooperation between opposition parties. I heard that mooted. So there is obviously he's trying to entrench like Xi Jinping in China wants to be the emperor for the rest of his life. But we've heard already, of course, that other people in the Conservative Party are not so sure about that one. But even if they threw him out, there would still be the prospect of eternal Conservative rule.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Martin, would you be kind enough to pose the next question and take it away? Cheers. You unmute yourself, Martin. Martin, we can't hear you.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm posing a situation, Anthony, where you're talking to Andrew Adonis, and I completely subscribe to your view that there is a fundamental conflict, in a way, between the hard rejoiner group being the advocates of electoral reform, because very quickly the connection is made that we're doing that out of the interest in rejoining the EU, not because of the democratic benefits. If you were talking to Andrew Adonis about that conflict, what would you be advising him to do as far as the European movement is concerned in squaring that circle?
Yes, well, of course, you're quite right that there is that difficulty to be faced. I think the thing to do is to be to take a leaf out of Boris Johnson's book and be a bit disingenuous and say, look, just forget the EU thing for the moment and just have a look at the great importance of achieving electoral reform. That anybody ought to be interested in that, independently of what else might follow. Because after all, you could always say to people, and it would have the merit of being true, that a reformed parliament may decide not to rejoin Europe or to give us another say, although my own view is that it would be very receptive to it. But we ourselves would have to do the decoupling. When people say to us, oh, you're only doing that, but you're not real Democrats, you just want to get back in the EU. We say, nope, I may indeed think that, but I'm also very, very passionately committed to the principle that an electoral system ought to be properly representative. And by the way, you could thrust into their hands a copy of my book, The Good State. Now, there's a commercial break here, but I do think that the argument that I put forward in favor of electoral reform, and by the way, codifying at least some aspects of our constitutional arrangements, those arguments are unanswerable. They're not mine, they're out there in the public domain.
Okay, that's
We'll
great.
give you a free advert and put it on our website, Anthony.
Okay. Well, many thanks for having me.
Okay, and yes, on behalf of everyone who's here, and indeed the people who will have the benefit of seeing this broadcast at a later date, we'd like to thank you very much, Anthony, for the time you've given us this evening and your inspiring views on how we might rejoin the EU. So I think I think we can all feel reinvigorated by the prospect. So thank you for bringing that to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.